Well, the next session, I will not compare in terms of importance the previous session on the future of the European Union. By the way, let me say that as I am the organizer of the whole conference, I refrain myself to give my specific opinions on certain subjects, but if I had been a panelist on the session on the European Union, I would probably have been much more pessimistic on the post-war situation of the European Union, and I would probably also have insisted more on the role of the United States after the war, and also the fact that this war is not, as somebody said, a war against Ukraine and the rest of the world. The rest of the world does not consider that Russia is fighting particularly, typically, a country like India, for instance, definitely does not perceive the situation in those terms. So I just say that in passing, and I switch to Indo-Pacific. But in a sense, you know, there is an intellectual link here, which will be the thread, the red thread along this coming session. What do we mean exactly by the Indo-Pacific region? You know, the terminology in geopolitics is very important. The region we are talking about has received a number of names over centuries and over decades. For instance, in the 18th, the beginning of the 19th century, we used to speak, or our predecessors used to speak about Indochina. Indochina was not what we still call sometimes Indochina. It was India and China, and the seas in between. So the Indo-Pacific concept has emerged relatively recently. And the big question, the key question I would like to ask the four panelists is this new geopolitical concept meant to represent something like an alliance against China? So most people who partly think that the answer is yes would say publicly no. So my question is simple. What do we mean by Indo-Pacific? And I will give the floor. I could take actually any order, but since I have Mr. Hiroyuki Akita, who is a very well-known commentator in Japan, I will give him the floor first.
Thank you very much for having me here today. I participated in this conference last year through online, and I felt very lonely being alone in my room, being away from Abu Dhabi. So I'm very, very glad to be here today, finally. And in my maybe about 5 to 7 minutes comment, I'd like to make a 2 points about the concept of Indo-Pacific. First point is about the 3 different kinds of concept that comes in my mind. And then second point is about 3 different approaches based on 3 different concepts. So first point, 3 different kinds of concept. I'm not the expert on the French painting, but I know that there are 3 categories of painting. One is a portrait painting, portrait, very, very clear, almost like a photograph, very clear paint. And second one is an impressionist painting, so like a Renoir. I hope my French pronunciation is not too terrible, but Renoir, like a Manet. And a bit vague paint, vague. And third category is pointillism, pointillism painting is George Seurat. Am I correct? No, George Seurat. So it's, you put a dot on a white canvas, and dot will lead to a very vague paint. So portrait painting, and impressionist painting, and pointillism painting. I think these are the concepts, three different kinds of concepts in the Pacific, and I support impressionist concept. Then I will explain it later. So second point is that, then what is a specific approach to Indo-Pacific based on the different three kinds of concept? First approach is sharing interest approach. It's almost like putting a dot on the canvas, so it's almost like a Giorgio Seurat type of approach. Under this approach, every country can cooperate each other as long as you can share the interest, economic interest or political interest or security interest. You don't care whether they are democracy or autocrat or whatever. So, for example, economic infrastructure project, joint project in several other key areas could be a sharing interest project. So under this approach, we cooperate with, for example, China, or Brunei, Kingdom, or Vietnam, a communist regime. It doesn't matter. So then second level of the approach is impressionist approach. That is maybe, in other words, sharing norms, sharing norm approach. For example, sharing common norm means rule of law or freedom of navigation under the UNCLOS, or if it is an economic infrastructure project, maybe sharing common norm would be transparency or debt sustainability or governability and so on. So sharing norm approach. And then highest level and most difficult approach is sharing value approach. So under this approach, a like-minded country that can share the value, maybe from the Western point of view, value of the democracy, will cooperate each other and then try to promote common value. I think that maybe Biden administration, to some extent, try to adapt sharing value approach. But the weakness of this approach is that you cannot cooperate with potentially important partner like Vietnam, because Vietnam is not democracy, and obviously we cannot cooperate with China on the sharing value approach. So I think that best approach for me is sharing norm. Not sharing interest approach is good and very comfortable. You can cooperate with everybody, including China, but it doesn't lead, it will lead us to economic prosperity, but it doesn't create any order, just sharing interest. But the sharing value approach is good, but also cannot incorporate many countries. So in between, sharing norms, freedom of navigation, rule of law, or transparency of infrastructure projects, sharing norm could be a reasonable approach. And I think that that is the approach I support, and also more or less Japanese government has been trying to promote. Under this, maybe we can also cooperate with China, or urge China to accommodate UNCLOS in the South China Sea, and so on. So that is my comment. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your, I think, fundamentally impressionist approach to geopolitics. The problem, but maybe we shall discuss that a bit later, is sometimes when a real confrontation comes before us, we have to make real choices.
Right.
And so maybe we can discuss this a bit later. And now I will give the floor to our great friend of the WPC, Mr. Narayanan, who was particular in his long and impressive career, the National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. And the position of India is particularly important these days, not only vis-à-vis China, but also vis-à-vis the current Ukrainian war and many other issues. So I am very pleased to give you the floor.
Thank you, Monte Terry. Thank you for this very generous introduction, which I don't deserve. I hope you would permit me to make a few specific opening remarks. And having been behind the scenes for over 60 years of my life and career, I have some prepared remarks which I would do. I almost seem to have anticipated what you mentioned when you said just now. What do you mean by the Indo-Pacific, and why the Indo-Pacific? In India, the concept of the Indo-Pacific is generally seen as a geographical space rather than an artificial construct. Not seen as evidence of what you call a group of nations ganging up against China, but it was seen as a means of getting countries which have similar thoughts and ideas together. But of late, I would say, at least the strategic community in India tends to regard this as having become the primary zone of strategic competition in today's world. I know Ukraine occupies a lot of space in the European thinking, but I do think that a far greater conflict is in the offing as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned. And that will cover not merely the nations of Asia and adjoining areas, but I believe across the world. So for that reason, why do I say this? Today, unlike in the case of Ukraine and Russia, where the lines are drawn very clearly, in the Indo-Pacific, what we have is a greater contestation and debate as to two basic philosophies that are present, and not really in terms of the military per se. And it's about the rules of international order. We have not gone into a major war as such, but the rules of international order. Who decides to draw the lines as far as the world is concerned? And more importantly, who is allowed to write the rules? Because if you have the right to write the rules, then what they say is right. So I think that's the major importance of what we mean today by the Indo-Pacific. Coming to the next aspect, I would say that India has generally been allergic to alliances of any kind. That has been its standing policy. We had non-alignment. I know that the West in particular were not particularly happy about non-alignment, but over the years and the centuries, India is a very old country, it's been obvious that we don't take what you call partisan policies in these matters. We like to take up issues rather than have alliances of various kinds. But a few years ago, India decided to become a member of what is generally referred to as a Quad, but the full terminology is the Indo-Pacific Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. The other members of this are the United States, Japan, and Australia. Initially, it was conceived as a means to strengthen the democratic forces in the region, without specifying China, but obviously it was intended against China. But at that time when it was conceived and for a few years thereafter, India did not subscribe to the view that Quad should be viewed as a defense alliance. Today, however, I think India is shifting its posture in this regard. Why do I say this? Because if you look at the way India is progressing today, the scope and ambit of India's defense diplomacy has vastly expanded. We have what is fairly well known in our part of the world, the Malabar naval exercises. I think my two co-panelists would realize it. And that has been expanded. We now have Australia and Japan as members of the Malabar exercises. India and Japan and India and Australia have also now endorsed the 2+2 format, the US 2+2 format, so as to include their defense ministers alongside their foreign ministers in the dialogue. Today in the Indo-Pacific, we have, separate from the Quad, the US, Australia, and the UK, who have a separate defense pact, the AUKUS as it's called, AUKUS. All three members of this pact are treaty partners. And the objective of the alliance is therefore clear, it doesn't have to be specified. What I would like to put out at this point is, whether it is a Quad or the AUKUS, I'm unsure what it would be the impact of this as far as limiting China's aggressive designs are concerned. And I think this is a matter which can be debated. What should be of greater concern, at least, is the rapid pace at which China is pursuing its revolution in military affairs. I think this is going on at a pace. I don't think it finds adequate mention, at least in the general writings that are present. And much of it is driven by artificial intelligence systems. And what permeates through the various channels that are present, it is quite frightening, and in many ways is far advanced than every other country in the world, with the possible exception of the United States. There is also China's escalation domination matrix, in which nuclear weapons and new forms of hybrid warfare form a constituent part. Not much advertised, but nevertheless present as far as we are concerned. Most important is China's total disregard for international covenants, as also its willingness to use force to achieve its objectives in the South China Seas. All this is, in a sense, leading India to revisit some of its concepts. The China-Taiwan tensions do not impact very much as far as India's diplomatic overreach is concerned. But we have very warm relations with Taiwan, and China's oft-repeated threats to invade Taiwan by force does underscore the idea that this is a matter of strategic importance for all nations in the Indo-Pacific. One matter of concern for people in India, though seldom expressed in public, is that few of the countries in the Asian region are willing to stand up to or engage in a conflict with China. India views this as indirect encouragement to China to act with impunity and to disregard the views of its Asian neighbors. Let me conclude my opening remarks by affirming what is the subject of today's discussion. That reading China correctly is the key to the relevance of the Indo-Pacific. That is the heading of it. The relevance of the Indo-Pacific as a strategic concept. I think reading China correctly is perhaps the most important part of this. No doubt, and I don't think there's anybody in the room or outside who does not view China as the 400-pound gorilla in the Indo-Pacific. Yet, even though India and China have a running conflict, particularly over the 7,000-kilometer land border, I want to say, having spent years in India, I was there in 1962 when China first invaded India. I was on the China desk in my organization. I've been there right through several successive periods when India and China have had conflicts. As a national security advisor, I had several rounds of discussions with the leadership in China. I had an opportunity to with Mr. Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, etc. I know their views. For them, there are no friends. And certainly India is not a friend, as far as I'm concerned. But yet, as a practitioner or somebody who's been the guy, I would say that we need to be careful as to how we see and deal with China. We cannot take sort of anticipatory moves, if I might say so, because China is a very complex country. If you do a kind of a military overreach, as you can hear from time to time when people talk about this, I think there are problems for the Indo-Pacific per se. I draw the attention, and I say this with greater courage today than I would have done yesterday when I heard Mr. Kevin Rudd talk about it. The 20th Chinese Party Congress has just taken place. The conventional view is that it has reinforced the opinion that China is ready to take on the world, more or less, or take over, sort of eclipse the United States as the #1 world power, etc. Many of us who have studied China over the years would, however, see things rather differently. It's a much more inward-looking document. The principal concern of Xi Jinping is, how do I consolidate my position in the party, and what do I need to do for that? Protecting the the identity of the Chinese Communist Party, not letting it go, what happened in Russia, is his principal message that comes through from this. I would therefore say that rather than looking at it purely from the point of view, how do we tackle China's aggressive designs, we must understand what China is about and how do we deal with it, because the geostrategic concept of the Indo-Pacific is very important for most of us who live and have to consider living in that region. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for this most interesting presentation. And I think that one dimension of international politics that is missing for the Europeans particularly is to dig more towards understanding the others, to understand the others in depth, and not to consider that their own paradigm prevail over the rest of the world. And I think that explanations illustrate that very well. So now I'm giving the floor to Douglas Pal, who was chairing a session yesterday. He too was involved in national security affairs, not of India, not to my knowledge of India, but the United States. And so he has also a wonderful combination of experience in government and also in think tanks as now. And Douglas, I hope you will clarify a little bit this Indo-Pacific concept from the viewpoint of the United States.
Well, thank you, Thierry, and I want to follow up precisely on what you said and take advantage of Mr. Narayanan's
Did you say young?
Take advantage of your sage observations.
Okay, I thought you said young Narayanan.
As a point of departure, which is, for me, it's always useful to remind myself as an American and my colleagues in the country that we tend to, as a result of our unique geography and relatively short history, tend to think of foreign policy problems as things you address, you solve, you move on. Whereas if you're living in India next to China, you've been there for a few thousand years, the likelihood is you'll be there for a few more thousand years. So you can't always solve the problem, you have to manage it. You have to deal with it. And this has been a challenge for the US in the framework of the Indo-Pacific, as we were calling it today. To fast forward quickly historically, in World War II, we had Asia forced upon an internally focused America, and the decision was made to emphasize or prioritize victory in Europe before Asia, and the conflict was left. And the question of how to deal with Asia was resolved technologically by the discovery of the atomic bomb, which shortened the war and allowed the US to move on to post-war conditions. In the aftermath of that, a decade later, we tried to organize East Asia under John Foster Dulles and Dwight Eisenhower as one of the poles in dealing with the great Cold War competition with the Russians and the Soviet Union. And we organized in 1954 in Bangkok an organization called SEATO, which was to be the Asian NATO, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. And that had a very ill-fated life because it never really adapted to the realities of a post-colonial Asia, an emerging Asia, a very diverse, culturally, ethnically, economically diverse Asia. Fast forward again, at the end of the Cold War, we saw the unipolar moment coming, sort of, and Australia's Bob Hawke, the Prime Minister at the time, said what we need is to create an Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, APEC. Some people have said this is 4 adjectives in search of a verb, but we tried to find a way of pulling together the Asia trends, but mostly an economic framework on it, trying to address the very strong economic relationship between the United States and Asia, where American market demand was feeding the rapidly developing economies of then Korea, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, eventually Thailand. And APEC had its moment for the 1990s. And we went into the period of globalization. And we didn't think so much in terms of Southeast Asia or East Asia or Africa. We thought in terms of movement of capital, global supply chains, seeking opportunities. And Asia had very friendly governments in many cases, the Asian tigers who welcomed that kind of investment. So we had a period where a very strong American economic market role sat alongside the leftover alliances that had been a legacy of World War II and its aftermath. And this continued fairly satisfactorily until 2007, 2008 with the global financial crisis. And globalization came under challenge, and during which China had become a member of the WTO. And we started to see the shift from the American market being the centerpiece for economic activity in the Asia-Pacific region to something new. And we're still adjusting to that. We haven't been able to disaggregate what we want to do economically with what we want to do strategically. And I think that brings us to today, where we face 3 kind of large contradictions in American policy towards the Indo-Pacific. The first is, as I say, economics versus security. The Asian Pacific countries, or the Indo-Pacific countries, have economic priorities that are not looking for strategic or security conflicts. The second, and the Americans have been oscillating between the two before 2010. Since 2010, the rise of Chinese military power and comprehensive capabilities has started the focus of the U.S. to shift from the economic, where the U.S. is no longer the market of greatest relevance to the partners in East Asia Pacific, and to focus more on the security side. We're also seeing a contradiction in the region with the U.S. over coalitions versus fragmentation. The current Biden administration, people will talk about the building of the Quad, the reinforcement of the G7, the continued, though reduced role of the G20, and new coalitions of countries who are resistant to what they see as Chinese aggression in the Asia-Pacific region and want to form informal arrangements to resist further Chinese encroachments. This coalition contradiction can be seen. We're talking about the Indo-Pacific, so we've got India at one end and the US at the other end of the Pacific. But the 3 big coalitions economically in the region are the RCEP, the Comprehensive Partnership for Pacific Trade, CPTPP, and the Digital Economic Framework, of which neither India nor China nor the United States is a member. So the coalition is going on with their own dramatic developments, and yet we're outside them. And finally, we have an increasingly legalistic, regulatory, securitized approach of the U.S. to transactions between Indo-Pacific countries and China. And I think the outlook is for far more intervention by the U.S. into trade, investment, and technology relationships as we go forward. So the contradictions and the challenges of the Indo-Pacific, I think, stand foremost in the prospect that I see for the next few years in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Douglas. very interesting, but a bit impressionistic too. Let me, before giving the floor to Im Sung-joon, I will ask the first three speakers one question, but please answer by yes or no, or that is, or something like that. We'll say binary answer. My question is the Indo-Pacific concept primarily a security concept or an economic concept? Mr. Akita.
Both.
You remind me of President Macron, for whom every issue is yes and no.
Yeah, actually, 70% security, 30% economic. Because without security, we cannot prosper.
Okay, that reminds me, Deng Xiaoping saying that Mao Zedong was 70% or 80% right, and therefore the rest. No, Mr. Narayanan.
I think the persons who came up with the Indo-Pacific concept saw it primarily as a defense or a military alliance.
Primary defense?
Primarily. I mean, India did not fully subscribe to it, but gradually I think is moving in that direction.
Douglas.
My view is that most of our Asian partners would view this as primarily economic, and the United States would view it as primarily security-driven.
But in their mind, it is primary security.
Yes.
So now, Im Sung-joon, first, I would like to remind also that you also had a very distinguished career in the diplomatic service of your country, in particular as well as a national security advisor. So we have very experienced personalities with us this morning. I would like also to remind that you are one of the friends of the WPC of the longest standing. And I remember our discussion in a hotel in Seoul in early, I think in 2007, when we discussed this project, and you were one of the very first to support this. So thank you very much for everything. And now your views on this Indo-Pacific concept that South Korea joined lately with a lot of hesitations. And perhaps, since time is short, perhaps also you could add some remarks on a more immediate issue, which is the latest developments in North Korea and the way they affect or are perceived in your country. Please.
Thank you, Thierry, for remembering me as one of the old friend of this.
I didn't say
WPC.
old. I say friend of longest stand.
Longest. Well, I'm very happy to be back to WPC. In 3 years, I was unable to make it because of all the pandemic-related restrictions. But it's great to be here. And well, about the topic we are taking up in this session, Indo-Pacific and its relevance. I mean, so I focused on its relevance to the Korean Peninsula and to my country. As you mentioned, Korea is an Indo-Pacific country, and but we have to admit that this idea of Indo-Pacific framework was, first floated by Japan and later the United States. So I want to take a practical approach, to understand and trying to explain where is the Korea's position vis-a-vis Indo-Pacific strategy. Well, Indo-Pacific as a strategic concept was floated more than a decade ago. However, it gained global attention only after US President Trump referred to the free and open Indo-Pacific during his visit to Asia. Soon after that, US administration officially replaced the Asia-Pacific, which is very familiar, in all the Asian countries, but with Indo-Pacific to describe the U.S. strategic sphere across Asia. The U.S. free and open Indo-Pacific is a nutshell, a manifestation of a hegemonic competition with China. We cannot, we have to admit, this as preposition for the Indo-Pacific strategy. And the geopolitical scheme to counterbalance China, which has been extending its influence over a wide region with its rising military and economic capabilities. U.S. was very much concerned about Chinese building a sphere of influence from the Eastern China Sea to the Indian Ocean, thereby restricting U.S. global power projection and leadership in the international system over the longer term. After that, the U.S. has moved its strategic pivot westward from the Asia-Pacific to include India and the Indian Ocean rim. And finally, it modified its military doctrine to rename the U.S. Pacific Command as the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. Biden administration, which denied everything made by Trump, but they inherited, his policy of Indo-Pacific strategy and released Indo-Pacific strategy report in February this year. From the beginning, the U.S. considered South Korea, Japan, Australia, and India as key allies in its efforts of pushing forward the IPS. But Korea was not in the first, membership, and we delayed, joining the Indo-Pacific framework proposed by the U.S. administration. Well, there are now three pillars, as our participants mentioned. Quad. Well, I thought Korea was, in earlier stage, a member of Quad, but somehow of the Korean domestic political situation and the Korean Peninsula security situation, we could not join the Quad at an early stage. And AUKUS is not, Asian. It involves the UK in counterbalance China. And because, we talked about what is the components of Indo-Pacific strategy. Is it security or economy? Well, I agree that, security size is more than economic side. So many Asian countries, reluctant to join directly, the US-led IPS. So President Biden, proposed an economic basket, to include, some lingering Asian nations, as called IPEF, economic, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Korea joined the IPF already, but Korea's full policy of Indo-Pacific strategy has yet to come. Well, they are preparing to announce maybe by the end of this year. So I'd like to, explain why Korea has delayed its membership with IPS. Well, South Korea's hesitation was due to its preoccupation with North Korea, mostly the nuclear issue. The foreign and security policy of South Korea has been always set on inter-Korean issues, especially in the pro-North Korean administrations in Korea. Second, the US FOIP was formulated to target the rise of China. Therefore, supporting the US FOIP would complicate South Korea's relations with China, now its top trading partner. Well, we have normalized relations with China over the 3 decades. We have, well, as many countries, regard China as #1 trading partner, including South Korea. We have over 300 billion, trade with China. And China is a long-time stakeholder in the inter-Korean relations. As long as South Korea's foreign policy revolves around North Korea and inter-Korean issues, South Korea cannot afford to antagonize China. So it delayed Korea's membership. And third, President Moon, taking office in 2017, embarked on a new South Korean diplomatic initiative called the New Southern Policy. We want to advance to the ASEAN region. So Korea has been very active in providing the development assistance for all the ASEAN countries. So we want to get beyond the Korean Peninsula, reaching the ASEAN area. So it could be called the Korean version of the Indo-Pacific strategy. By doing so, South Korea managed to secure autonomy and non-military engagement with the IPS. But after Biden took over the US administration, South Korea's stance on the Indo-Pacific started to change. This year, we had a conservative government led by President Yoon Suk-yeol sworn in, and South Korea participated in the first Quad Plus meeting along with New Zealand and Vietnam. A more noticeable shift in South Korea came during the Washington summit between President Moon and President Biden in May 2021. In the later presidency of President Moon's administration, began to realize that President Biden's foreign policy was single-mindedly focused on maintaining US dominance over China and rallying its allies and partners around the anti-China network. If South Korea is isolated further, it would face the risk of damaging South Korea's inter-Korean relations, including the denuclearization of North Korea and US indifference to South Korea's policy. So President Moon also began to move toward align South Korea with the US Indo-Pacific strategy. But the election of President Yoon early this year took a dramatic turn in shaping South Korea's future Indo-Pacific strategy. President Yoon, a Conservative Party candidate, vowed to strengthen US-Korea alliance relationship and reset China-Korea relationship, criticizing the previous administration for its lukewarm stances against China's cruelty during the election campaign. When there was a tension running very high on the Korean Peninsula around 2017, the US and South Korea decided to deploy THAAD batteries on the soil of the Korean Peninsula, which led a strong reaction from China. And China gave us some sanctions, 3 points. So, Korea-China relationship really, strained, and now we are still, under difficult situation in handling China-Korea relationship. So this is why Korea delayed, being a member of the Indo-Pacific Partnership. So I want to stop here for the time being.
Thank you very much, Sun Jun. So let me say briefly how I perceive this part of our session. I think that this concept of Indo-Pacific reflects a kind of very subtle but also unstable implicit equilibrium. And the problem is that no, as in my understanding, no country, particularly in Southeast Asia, wants to take sides too clearly, too openly in vis-à-vis the US-China rivalry. But since the whole construct is highly unstable, at any point something could happen that would in fact force some countries to take sides. Maybe not all. India, I think, has a very special role because India is becoming a giant. So as the current Indian foreign minister says almost every day, he is proud, India is proud of her civilization and intends to make their own choices by themselves. They don't want to be imposed any kind of strategy from outside. For Japan, Korea, the situation is much more complex. The margin of maneuver is much more limited. So I think we are talking about a very unstable situation, which is not surprising because the whole world is unstable today. And now we have 12 minutes for some discussion. I think that M. Cabestan est le premier que j'ai vu. I see 3 French potential speakers, which shows that France is indeed an Indo-Pacific power. Oui, micro.
Yes, it's on. Okay, well, thank you for the conference, for having put together this panel in the Indo-Pacific. Actually, your remark, Mr. Montbrial, you were pretty sensible on the idea that it's maybe an uncertain concept. But living in the Indo-Pacific myself, I tend to agree with Mr. Yim, who was the clearest speaker on this very concept of Indo-Pacific, supporting the view that actually its aim is to balance China's rising power. So I would like to ask the 3 other speakers, do you agree with Mr. Yim that the Indo-Pacific concept is aimed at balancing China in your region? And I have another question which is more specific related to India. And Mr. Narayana, you haven't talked very much about the relationship with China along the border. Do you think that your relation with China can go back to normal if the border issue is not solved? Or how do you see the way forward regarding the LAC and the border dispute with China? Do you think your relationship can stabilize with China in the coming years or not? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So what I will do, I will take 3 questions, and so I want not only to have French speakers. So I don't see you, but I see your hand. So if you can identify yourself, I cannot see you because of the light.
Okay, thank you. I'm Bayu from Indonesia. I think I would like to support Douglas' approach on the historical perspective of the Indo-Pacific cooperations. There is APEC, there is RCEP, there is Indo-Pacific, and so forth. So this is not the first initiative, and certainly will be not the last. Of maybe in the next years or years to come, another initiative. But for Indonesia, at least, this is not a question about security. It's a question more. Insecurity means military, no. But in terms of economics, yes. And we cannot choose between China and US. That both are our biggest trading partners. And not mentioning that within the Indonesia society, there is also the dimension of socio-cultural. We are linked to almost all of the countries in Asia, as well as US. We are very close one to another. And I think this initiative, we welcome it. But we, I think, put yesterday as a very good term on it, the multi-alignment approach. And I think many Asian countries will see that, at least in ASEAN. I'm certain that most of them will have that kind of approach. I would like to hear probably from our colleague in India and Japan how to see this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Michel Fouché, Hervé Mariton.
Yeah, just a remark. As far as I know, the mental map, because it's a map, it's about space, was first used by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in India in an address in 2007 in the Indian Parliament, with the idea of, I quote, the confluence of the two seas. In your view, this mental map was referring to which kind of concept? You mentioned with nice reference to the French aesthetics. Thank you for that.
Hervé Mariton.
Yes, Thierry was joking about French putting questions just now, and my question is actually to Thierry and others. When France underlines in its strategic review its Indo-Pacific dimension, do you understand this as an anecdote or something more serious?
Okay, so we can take. So please remain as concise as possible for the answers, so to have a chance to have another round of questions. So who wants to shoot first? Perhaps India first. By the way, as a mathematician, which I still claim to be, I am very much embarrassed by the concept of multi-alignment, which means nothing. Because there is a famous verse in a French poem which says, aimer tout le monde, c'est aimer personne. No, that is, to love everyone is to love no one. So, Mr. Narayanan.
Yeah. Okay. I think rather than addressing the individual questions that were raised, I'll just give you, I think because the major conflict in Asia today is between China and India. And what I would like to stress is that the conflict within India and China is not so much about territory or the seas, but I think it's a civilizational conflict. And China and India, at no time in the past or in the future, have been friends and will remain friends, because they are perennial opponents of two different philosophies. So let's start on the territorial point. I did not specify or make a reference to the border conflict between India and China because it is one of long-standing. It has several different facets. It's a long border. The problem for India has been, civilizationally, Indians are not map makers. All our traditions, all the writings are all oral rather than written. The Chinese are great at writing. I was, for 6 years or so, the special representative for border talks between India and China. Dai Bingao was my counterpart. And I could explain almost where a tree or a river or a watershed took away, but he would say, please produce a map. And there I used to be stymied on that point. So there we have an undemarcated border, and there are border skirmishes. And the way China operates is that whenever it thinks that India is going say, closer to the United States or closer to the anti-China group, they will rake up one of these issues. Galwan Valley, for instance. I've trekked in the Galwan Valley, so I know what I'm talking of. It's, in a sense, to begin with, it's very difficult to demarcate which is the border and which is the border. It's an unfortunate instance where actually people died. But normally, there are several skirmishes of the taking place on the border, because the forces which are there, they try to say that, they put up mounds of stones, etc., and somebody removes it, and that becomes an incident, etc. So, vis-a-vis the border skirmishes, while the Galwan Valley is a most unfortunate event, I think there are issues on both sides as to where the border really lies. I know that in 1960, when Chou En-lai came to India, Chou En-lai had made an offer saying, you give us most areas of Saksechen and you can have the entire waters, then the Northeast Frontier Agency. India was not willing to accept it. Then it keeps going up and down. Deng Xiaoping made the same thing in 1988 when Rajiv Gandhi went to China. So the border is a different issue. I mean, there will always be a kind of thing. Today, China is very much interested in the what we call Arunachal Pradesh, the Northeast Frontier, because the Brahmaputra River has become important. They are trying to dam the Brahmaputra. They have dammed the Brahmaputra, but the biggest dam is yet to come up. And the bend in the India means that the reservoir falls within India, and so that becomes an important issue. But on the structural plane, as India emerges as an important country in Asia, maybe an important country across the world, and the West starts courting India in many ways. I'm using the word very carefully. And if India is seen to be the recipient of all what the West has to offer in terms of technology and other matters, the conflict between China and India will intensify to a far greater degree. India has no ambitions on anything that the Chinese have. But it's essentially a concept of influence. The Chinese regard themselves as the only civilized nation in the world. I don't want to talk about what they say about the West, but and I think they consider the Indians also to be inferior. So there will always be a conflict between the two countries. What we need to do is to ensure, and what India tries to do, is to ensure that there is no major conflict. We believe that we can deal with all the issues that are paramount today without entering into a conflict. That's why we are not part of any major alliance. Because the situation in the Indo-Pacific has become a little tense, we have, in a sense, aligned ourselves with the Quad. Does not believe it as to be a defense alliance, but it's invariably or inevitably been drawn into that kind of situation. But we are hopeful that there will never be a conflict in which we have to take sides and engage in a war with China. So the basic point is to understand the nature of the India-China conflict. It's very different from territorial aggrandizement or this and that. We have no problems with the rest of Asia. I mean, I heard the gentleman from Indonesia. I mean, Indonesia and India have a common culture of every kind, I mean, including religious culture. So the point I'm trying to stress is, do not see the Sino-Indian conflict as one for territorial aggrandizement or conflict. It's of which particular system or philosophy will prevail. I rest my case because Jerry has been sort of...
Yes, because unfortunately there is only 1 minute left.
Yeah.
So please, unfortunately, there will be no second round, and we have a very, very busy schedule, especially this afternoon. So please, very short remark.
Okay.
Sakita.
Yeah. So 2 points about the concept of Indo-Pacific. I said there's a portrait and impressionist and pointillism approach. These are not mutually exclusive. So countries who don't want to antagonize China can adopt interest-sharing approach. And those countries who want to shape the order, like Japan, maybe adopt no sharing normal approach. But maybe US wants to expand the democracy, so adopt sharing value approach. So these will go simultaneously. Everybody paint pointillism picture, impressionist picture, portrait picture at the same time, and this combined together will be in the Pacific order. And also, the purpose for us is not to choose. But in order not to choose, we have to avoid the war. And in order to avoid the war, we have to fix the balance of power in the region that has shifted to too favorable to China, militarily, economically. So in order to coexist with China without being have to choose, maybe we need to push back a little bit more, militarily, politically, so that we can coexist with China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Douglas?
Just very quickly, in contrast with this morning's discussion of how Europe has so successfully united in its reaction to the invasion of Ukraine, I think conflict of that nature in the Asia-Pacific region will not produce similar unified responses. It will be very much situationally determined. It will be coalitions of the willing, of different sizes, depending on the sense of what the threat is to their particular interests. But we're not going to see the kinds of unified coalition response in the Asia-Pacific region or Indo-Pacific region that you would in Europe.
Superior civilizations, Doug.
Yes.
Yes, well, I think, we have to align ourselves with the United States leadership to make the Indo-Pacific very free and peaceful and prosperous region. So it means that we have to invest. So, and one other latecomers to this IPS is Canada. Canada recently announced its participation and they laid out Indo-Pacific strategy to support long-time growth, prosperity and security, beginning with an investment of almost $2.3 billion over the next 5 years. I think this is the way we can mitigate the contradiction Doug explained between security and economy, which we should choose. So pouring money to make the region prosperous, then Indo-Pacific strategy will succeed. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. As for all panels, it is a bit frustrating because we would like to continue. Just one word to conclude. This illustrates that the world today, the current situation of the world, is much more complex than we are used to talk about, and that it is much more full of uncertainties, including, I insist, on Europe, because the purpose of the first session was to discuss the post-war Europe, and as you could see, it was very difficult to have the speaker speak really of that issue, the post-war Europe. So let us try to remain clear-minded. Thank you very much indeed, and now we switch to the next panel.